Henry Patrick Clarke, better known as Harry, was born in Dublin in 1889, the third child of Joshua and Bridget Clarke. His father ran a church decorating business, which crucially for Harry's future also involved the design and manufacture of both ecclesiastical and secular stained glass. Tragedy struck the family in 1903 when his mother died, and 2 years later, at the age of 16, Harry left school to become an apprentice in his father's studio and workshop. He worked there for the best part of 5 years, in which time he acquired an extensive knowledge of the stained glass process from beginning to conclusion. In the meantime, he also had more formal art study at Dublin's Metropolitan College of Art. He wasn't the most robust of young men, and in 1908 Clarke suffered a bout of what would be quite a few periods of ill health during what would ultimately be a woefully short time on Earth. In 1910, this stained glass window design won the gold medal when submitted to an Irish national competition, and its success led to more for other churches. But other than a couple of drawn images I found from this time, which may or may not have been published, it seems that working for print was not yet a particularly high priority. Nevertheless, in 1912 he persuaded his father to finance a stay in London in the hope of finding work as a book illustrator, and while there he worked on 2 projects. He created monochrome illustrations for Samuel Taylor Coleridge's The Rime of the Ancient Mariner and Alexander Pope's The Rape of the Lock, but neither was ever completed or published. He left London shortly after, and in 1914 he married Margaret Crilly, who he had originally met at the Metropolitan College. They set up home in Dublin and went on to produce 3 children in subsequent years. I can only assume his poor constitution meant he wasn't considered fit enough for military service during the Great War, and instead he embarked on the design, manufacture and installation of a large number of stained glass panels for the windows of the Honan Chapel situated in Cork. This extensive commission firmly cemented his reputation as a highly skilled and imaginative stained glass artist, and more commissions for similar ecclesiastical work came in thick and fast in the years that followed. Despite the inconclusive commissions he had begun while in London, he had not much later also been offered a particularly prestigious commission to illustrate a lavishly bound and printed edition of the Tales of Hans Andersen. He'd been working on this project even while occupied with the windows for the Honan Chapel, and the book was eventually printed and published in 1916, despite the effective wartime rationing of paper and printing inks. Clarke's images for the Andersen book featured 16 colour plates, which were created initially in pen and ink line and subsequently coloured by him using watercolour washes, and they were all printed with offset colour lithography, which despite the higher cost of the process was by this time widespread in the publishing of more expensive books. And although the line was finer than that necessarily used in stained glass, the demands of that process had obviously exerted a significant impact on his technique for print. Similarly, his figures were executed in a highly mannered style, and they were posed formally within the compositions. The presence of Aubrey Beardsley had always haunted Clarke's figure work, even in glass, and in print it was even easier to see. Along with his similarly styled friend and associate John Austin, Clarke had made no secret of his admiration for the doom-laden and decadent figure work of Beardsley, although his own subject matter never strayed into the more extreme salacious territory so beloved of the earlier illustrator. And this influence was even clearer to see in the 24 monochromes he also created for the book. Nevertheless, it was far from slavish, and the book proved a significantly popular illustrated debut with those who could afford it. It's also worth mentioning that at almost the same time, Danish illustrator Kai Nielsen also began illustrating lavish gift books, and he too shared a passion for the work of Beardsley. The two created some strikingly similar work during their careers, even taking on the same subject matter. Whether they knew each other I have no idea, but they must have been aware of their stylistic similarities. But despite his success in the world of publishing, stained glass continued to occupy much of his time, and in 1917 he was commissioned by the immensely wealthy businessman and patron of the arts, Lawrence Ambrose Walden, to create a series of small stained glass panels to illustrate J.M. Singer's poem titled Queens, which were to be displayed in his library. There were 9 panels in all, each measuring around a mere 30 centimetres by 18, but it nevertheless must have been a complex and painstaking undertaking, and those who interest themselves in and are authorities on the subject of stained glass speak of them in reverential tones. In 1919, Clarke published another illustrated book, his visualisation of Edgar Allan Poe's tales of mystery and imagination. It proved to be a particularly good fit, as his own outlook and choice of imagery was similarly bleak and haunted with troubling symbols and icons. The illustrations for this first edition of the book were monochrome only, but that was certainly not to their detriment, and each was possessed of an intense level of ink decoration that compelled the reader to be drawn into the illumination of the narrative in question. The Beardsley influence endured, but had by now been somewhat subsumed into a definable and distinctive personal approach. These illustrations featured none of the trademark large expanses of white space seen in Beardsley's illustrations, and all Clarke's drawings were dark, menacing, and hatched with any number and combinations of mark-making techniques. The end result was a collection of unforgettable images, which constituted an enduringly haunting visual interpretation of Poe's imaginative text. And despite the very mannered angular styling of Clarke's figurework, I did find evidence that at least on occasion he used Poe's photographs to inform the work. In this instance, Clarke himself feigning crucifixion for a stained glass design. In the same year, with the horrors of the First World War over, Clarke was also commissioned to decorate all the pages of no less than 8 printed volumes, recording the 50,000 Irish troops who had fought and died during the conflict. This was such a large undertaking that it wasn't actually completed and published until 1923. In 1920, the book The Years at the Spring, an anthology of verse, was published, with a range of compositions, some sparse and some more complex, rendered in pen ink and watercolour wash by Clarke. Given the poems were intended to be a child-friendly collection by various poets of the period, the tone of the illustrations in this collection was considerably lighter than his work for tales of mystery and imagination. Nevertheless, quite a few of the illustrations and the verses they accompanied were far from what you might call jolly, and the predominantly melancholic, occasionally romantic images were as always populated by languid, elongated figures, with not a single smiling face to be found. In addition to the colour images, there were even more monochromes evoking similar emotional responses, which in this instance did take a leaf out of the Beardsley playbook, with many featuring figures carefully cast adrift within great expanses of page white. It was undoubtedly a body of fascinating and aesthetically considered work, but some considerable distance from the usual more upbeat illustrations found in other books of verse for younger readers. In 1921, Clarke's father died, and he and his brother Walter took over management of the ecclesiastical decoration and stained glass business from this point onwards. The fairy tales of Perault had long held a fascination for many illustrators of the Golden Age, including the previously mentioned Kai Nielsen, and Clarke was no exception to the rule. In 1922, he published his visualisation of the tales in a gift book edition which featured the expected array of finely inked monochrome pen drawings and full-colour illustrations of Perault's various narratives, which generally conformed to Clarke's preference for smaller figures in a bigger landscape. As anyone would expect from Clarke, the figures were generally quite unanimated, and once more any signs of humour were conspicuously absent. But they were a collection of richly decorated and sensitively rendered visual interpretations of Perault's classic stories. In 1923, he also did some work for magazines, but the general lack of evidence suggests he wasn't comfortable with the constraints and short deadlines involved in such work. And it was also in 1923 that a second edition of Poe's Tales of Mystery and Imagination was published, and it included a handful of equally unsettling angular colour images interspersed among the monochromes already created for the first edition. Some of these were fairly benign and fanciful in their execution and subject matter, although as with the line drawings there were of course others that relished the evocation of the darker elements of Poe's writing. In 1924 he completed a stained glass project he'd been working on for some time, which was the Eve of St. Agnes. This wasn't an ecclesiastical commission and was created for Harold Jacob, about whom I could find no information whatsoever, but I'm guessing he was a wealthy businessman or dignitary of some sort. The window consisted of 22 small panels, each one illuminating a stanza from Keats's poem. And like much of Clarke's other secular and religious glass designs, it's considered to be a masterpiece. In the same year, Clarke took on a mission which for him was a rare and possibly unique commercial project for a pair of books which were in reality promotional devices to encourage the drinking of Jameson's Irish whiskey. The History of a Great House and The Elixir of Life were both illustrated with a series of decorative line-only images by Clarke and laid out to punctuate the text. These images were also unusual in Clarke's output, as they had a secondary colour added to his monochrome originals, which although quite appealing were almost certainly none of his doing. He returned to more expected narrative material in 1925 for his edition of Goethe's Faust, with full-colour pages and a larger volume of monochromes throughout. The tale of the protagonist's deal with the devil and the nightmarish narrative that follows was of course an ideal opportunity for Clarke to pursue his own conspicuously brooding imagination, with a collection of riotously disturbing scenarios featuring the usual cast of impossibly thin characters set in environments where every detail was as finely rendered as every other, making for an almost tapestry-like final outcome. Some of the more disturbing colour images seem to have taken their inspiration from the works of Hieronymus Bosch and his complex visions of hell. This was undoubtedly the perfect pairing of written and visual narrative, and understandably, Clarke's sympathetic interpretations of Goethe's moralising fantasy tale proved to be highly sought after by collectors. It was in 1928 that Clarke published the selected poems of Algernon Charles Swinburne, which featured more of his work executed with the expected authority of his pen and ink technique. But in this publication, the majority of the images were created and printed as half-tone monochromes, and this was not the wisest of decisions made by the publisher, as despite the undoubted quality of the supporting line work, they were uniformly muddy and conspicuously missing the jewel-like application of his intense colour washes. But he had also been hard at work on another stained glass project, which was intended to be a gift from Ireland to the League of Nations based in the Swiss city of Geneva. It's now considered to be another masterpiece of this particular art form, but ultimately the Irish government considered some of Clarke's subject matter unsuitably immoral in content. The window never made it to its intended destination, and Clarke, who by this time was also close to death with tuberculosis, was understandably distraught by this turn of events. In 1931 he set off for Dublin to die in his homeland, but only made it about 40 miles to the Swiss town of Chur, and that's where he was buried at the age of just 41. In his lifetime, Harry Clarke had been every bit as active as a stained glass designer, and probably even more so as he had as a book illustrator, with more than 130 designs to his credit. And he continues to have a well-deserved reputation for the excellence of his work in that field of creativity. But the body of illustration work he did create, however small relatively speaking, and a consequence of a life prematurely ended, continues to resonate with many, who find themselves drawn to its overwhelmingly gloomy atmosphere and brittle execution. Others, myself included, find it somewhat of an acquired taste for the very same reasons. But his significance in the development of what is essentially fantasy art, whether fairy tale or the darker territory of Poe and Goethe, cannot be denied. It seems tragically ironic that just like Beardsley, he was cursed with the deferred death sentence that was tuberculosis. And although Clarke lasted some 14 years or so longer than his hero, it's still hard not to speculate what else he might have achieved had he lived a few decades longer. And on a mildly depressing note, here are a few more examples of his work I couldn't squeeze in until now to draw this tribute to a close.